Welcome, everyone. Without finding resistance, the Taliban entered Kabul on August 15th of last year, putting an end of 20 years of U.S. occupation of the country. The hasty U.S. withdrawal from the country caused scenes of chaos in the streets around Kabul, especially the airport, and it was a move that was criticized by the international community. Afghanistan is now facing dire economic situation, as well as a lack of food, and that situation is being exacerbated by the end of flow of international aid that was propping up that country. However, Afghanistan now lives a new moment in history, one of peace.
It was truly an indication and a demonstration by the Afghan nation that they no longer wish to see a war continue to rage in Afghanistan for the interests of a very few specific individuals who have their interests tied to war and war profiteering. And it was a demonstration that it is time. It is time for, after 43 years, for Afghans to come together and live amongst themselves, be at peace with themselves and be at peace with the world, and have an opportunity to live a peaceful life within their own country.
So, to discuss the situation in Afghanistan, we welcome Ambassador Omar. He is the former Afghan ambassador to France and Canada and joins us from here in Washington, D.C. Also here in D.C., Ahmad Shah Mohibi is founder and president of Rise to Peace. From Rougemont, Switzerland, Sanam Anderlini is the founder and executive director of International Civil Society Action Network. And Benjamin Norton is an investigative journalist, and he joins us from Managua, Nicaragua, which I'm sure is an interesting story in its own right, but we're going to focus on Afghanistan today. Omar, I want to begin with you. I just got back from there. I was there for a few weeks leading up to this anniversary. And to a person, when I would speak to people on the street, they would say they were glad there was peace in the country for the first time in 43 years. Basically, almost 12 months without any significant incident except for minor skirmishes with ISIS, which of course has a toehold in there. You'd see the eyes, the ragged face, and people just weary of fighting. What do you make of this and what you heard from the Minister of Foreign Affairs at the top of the program? Is this where Afghanistan is now?
Well, welcome back, Sean. And I think what we do see after this watershed moment last year on this day, August 15th, when a president and his entourage fled on a helicopter, left the country unattended, with a city of almost 6 million people with no security force because they didn't know what to do and who to take orders from, and the Taliban at the gates of Kabul. We are now in a situation where, yes, the country is, to a very large extent, peaceful and stable, but that doesn't mean that there are no skirmishes here and there occasionally. And as you pointed out, that ISK is a threat still. But some people would paint this either as a black picture and others a white picture. I would say that we are in a gray zone in Afghanistan, meaning that there's a lot that has happened that is dramatic and historic. 26 years later, the Taliban are back. No one believed it. Nobody could think that this would happen. But right now, the Afghan people, they may have a semblance of peace and security and stability, but they're also suffering heavily because of the sanctions and because of the fact that the coffers were empty. And so people are hungry in the millions, and there's no money.
Indeed. Omar, we're having a lot of difficulty with your signal. Omar, we're having a lot of difficulty with your signal. We're going to try and reconnect with you, but I'm going to move on to Sanam, because Sanam, obviously, one of the biggest issues, if not the largest to the international community as well as the United Nations, that of women's rights issues. I want to talk with you about where you think that is right now. So many women fired from government jobs, can't go into government buildings. They must go out in public with a male member of the family, must be covered from head to toe. Is this turning the clock back? What does this do for women in Afghanistan?
Well, I think the image, thank you very much for having me. Today is indeed a very important day. I think the images that you showed tell the story. There was not one single woman on the streets of Kabul. And to your point about who you spoke to, I'm curious of how many women you asked and how many girls you may have met to see what they say, because as much as the war, the American occupation, and the Taliban's own attacks on civilian sites has ended, because now they've taken over the country, they've basically initiated a de facto war on women and girls, and of course the minority populations. So the fact that it's been a year now that Afghan girls have not been able to go to school, that Afghan women are not able to work, that the basic life and livelihood for, imagine all the women police officers. There were over 3,000 women police officers. What's happened to them? These things are still going on, and it's become a sort of version of gendered apartheid and a war on women. And I'm not sure how a country can survive if this is how it treats half its population.
I think those are all very good points. I want to follow up. To be honest, we interviewed 3 women on camera. We were able to speak with some off camera, but 2 of them were the brave women who demonstrated this weekend. The demonstration was disrupted when the Taliban went up and fired AK-47s over their head to disperse the crowd. And in the spirit of full disclosure, I want to tell you the Ministry of Foreign Affairs told us that women would be allowed to demonstrate, that they do offer women that right. But look, this is what happens when women go to demonstrate. And they also said, the ministry also told us that part of the problem is this tribal nation has so many areas that are so conservative that if they pushed for changes too fast, they would not be accepted in those areas. Is that something, Sanam, that you can live with?
I mean, let's put it this way. Afghanistan has a very young population. Over 62% of the population of the country are under the age of 25. Over 40% are under the age of 14. Talking about this as a conservative country or not, this is also a country that for the last 20 years, women and girls have been allowed to go to school, women have been working. From my organization in the last year, we have been helping journalists, lawyers, police officers, community peace builders who are all at risk trying to leave the country. They're coming from everywhere. They have been active everywhere. So I think that actually the issue here is that the Taliban is really behind in terms of what Afghan society has and has become. And this is, their war on women seems to be in some ways something that they're imposing as if the rest of the world cares about Afghan women. We know that the rest of the world was willing to forsake women's rights, but really the issue is, why do they not care about the future of their own women and girls and their own daughters and sons going forward? You can't have a society when half its population is locked up inside and illiterate. And it's not a cultural thing. It's not a religious thing. This is an ideological stance that they're taking.
And Ahmad, to build on that, part of this problem with this hunger crisis, the poverty, malnutrition that has really enveloped that nation, is the fact that so many women lost their jobs. They were breadwinners in households, and now they obviously are not bringing in any money. Let's talk about the crisis of world hunger right now. The World Food Program estimates that some 18 million Afghans are simply not getting enough to eat. And as many as just 50% of the nation faces acute hunger, including 1.1 million children, babies, infants, who could die this year because of malnutrition. Let's put that into perspective. 250,000 people died in 20 years of fighting, civilians and Afghan police and soldiers. What do you take from all this?
Well, I mean, right now, Afghans don't have food on their table. They have no freedom. They have no education. I mean, girls and women have been marginalized. We're talking about 38 million people living in Afghanistan, and 25 million are facing hunger and famine. So 75% of Afghanistan GDP in the previous government was from foreign aid. So it's been 1 year, Afghans are dying, and without a lot of mass media coverage. So it's very uncertain, it's sad, it's catastrophic, it's chaotic. I mean, we're looking into, there is no hope. The world has isolated Afghanistan. I mean, Afghanistan has faded away. So there is no, I would say, solution to it as of right now. The Taliban, no country on earth has recognized them. Of course, there are several reasons why they don't want to recognize them. But at the end of the day, Afghans are dying. You're paying the price. The past 20 years, they paid the price for terrorism and this rebuilding of Afghanistan. Before that, Afghanistan was paying the price for the proxy war and the Cold War. And right now, they're paying the price for Afghanistan being under the Taliban. So we are speaking at the end of the day, Afghans want food. They say, screw your democracy, screw your whatever you want to call it. We want food. So if there is no food, there's no democracy. There's no food, there's no peace. So I think that's what Taliban imposing on these people is harsh restriction. Look, the Taliban want the people to grow beard, but they didn't have bread. So I think these are main challenges. We're looking into the $9 billion frozen asset of Afghanistan that this could help Afghans. At the same time, we see challenges. If that is unfreeze, then possibility the Taliban could use that. So there is a uncertainty with Afghans. A bunch of thieves were running the former president, the former Afghan government. Right now, a bunch of, I would say, radicals and mullahs, those who just believe they can build a system. But at the end of the day, we didn't understand what policies, what strategies, didn't have a roadmap for Afghanistan. So food is key to peace as of right now.
Indeed. Benjamin, I want to build on what Ahmad just talked about. He said that a bunch of thieves were running Afghanistan. I want to play you a soundbite from former President Ashraf Ghani, who was on CNN this weekend. Here's what he had to say.
All the money, at least 80% or 90% of the money that came to Afghanistan went to large contractors. And they take a cut of from 40% to 80%. This money did not reach Afghanistan. And humanitarian aid, now they want to take the money that I saved. That's money that we had secured through incredibly hard work with the IMF and others.
He is quite a lightning rod right now. Benjamin, I want to talk about that. Your thoughts on what the former president said. He's also, his administration being investigated for basically looting perhaps hundreds of millions of dollars as the nation fell. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite ironic hearing Ashraf Ghani speak about thieves, considering he's been accused, I would say rather credibly, of corruption and even potentially taking millions of dollars of state assets. I should note that CGAR, the U.S. government office, was investigating this, and Ashraf Ghani refused to respond to CGAR's questions into that investigation. But when we're talking about thieves, I think there's another important player that we have to acknowledge here is engaged in thief-like behavior, which is unfortunately the U.S. government. It has frozen an estimated $9 billion of Afghan central bank reserves, which has caused an economic meltdown in the country. And I agree with all of the guests that, you know, people in Afghanistan are first and foremost concerned with having food on their table, with surviving. And the reality is that the currency crisis created by freezing the Afghan central bank's reserves has, you know, been condemned by United Nations experts. In fact, just a few days ago, 70 economists, including the Nobel Prize winner for economics, Joseph Stiglitz, and Yanis Varoufakis, published an open letter condemning the U.S. government and calling on the Biden administration to unfreeze these assets, which belong to the Afghan central bank. I mean, the reality is that the U.S. ended the military war in Afghanistan, but has continued the economic war. And I'm certainly no fan of the Taliban, but one of the tragedies of the 20-year U.S. war, in addition to the nearly 200,000 Afghans who died, according to Brown University, in addition to the tens of thousands of civilians who died, one of the tragedies is that the U.S. NATO military occupation legitimized the Taliban. A lot of people in Afghanistan, they certainly didn't support the Taliban, but they wanted the war to end. So the U.S. needs to recognize its responsibility in helping to create this crisis. And one of the bare minimum things that it can do is unfreezing those assets that belong to the Afghan central bank so people can pay for food.
Omar, when I worked for the U.S. Embassy in Afghanistan, one time one of my grantees was accused of stealing $650,000. And I'll say that individual did steal the $650,000. I tried to get it back, and when I complained to U.S. security at the embassy, one guy said, "Why are you so worked up over $650,000? At that point, I thought, okay, the wheels have just come off. And building on that, the U.S. government now, it's clear it's spent $145 billion trying to rebuild Afghanistan. There's very little accounting for that money. Benjamin just mentioned SIGAR, the Special Investigative Unit that's working. Are we ever going to get answers, or is it just a horribly missed opportunity?
I hope we do get answers. The Afghan people deserve, the American taxpayer deserves it, the European taxpayers deserve an answer as to what happened to all this money, where did it go, and who used it for what, of course, contractors use, NGOs use it, you take a cut. But at the end of the day, if you look at Afghanistan today, there's been some change, there's been some reforms, there have been some infrastructure built and all kinds of economic incentives and progress in so many different fields. But at the same time, if you look at, and it's not 140 something, Sean, it's closer to 200 billion of American money if you include the money that was spent on building the Afghan security forces. And so we are talking about a total $2.3 trillion overall American expenditure in about the war in Afghanistan that includes the American military. It's astronomical, and for it we don't see a lot. And so as soon as the government fell, the country's economy collapsed as well. The bank, the central bank, was almost empty, and whatever, as the other said, was overseas has been frozen. So we need solutions, outside the box solutions. The problem is political. The problem is the fact that the Taliban are unwilling to make compromises on some issues, and the international community is unwilling to make compromises on some other issues. So it's become sort of a chicken and egg issue.
I think that's a very good, fair point. And Ahmad, in a piece in the Washington Post, journalist Fareed Zakaria said the Afghan government was basically dependent on the U.S. to prop up its government all those times, and that's why it became so massively corrupt. We're talking about women's issues, missed opportunities. I want to play you a soundbite from one of those brave women willing to go to the streets to demonstrate, and this is what she had to say about the last 20 years and the leaders in Afghanistan.
We know in Afghanistan, we do not have a good political leaders. The political leaders were very corrupt person. They are misusing from all the resources of Afghanistan. They are also misused from positive opportunity in 20 years. They couldn't use from being of NATO and international community in Afghanistan for benefit of Afghan people.
You know, it's really heartbreaking that the international community has just turned its eyes away from Afghanistan.
It is. Well, the whole problem started in Afghanistan was the flow of billions of dollars in Afghanistan. Afghans never saw dollars. When the war on terror started, the U.S. government poured billions of dollars in bags of money in cash to the leaders. First, the leaders became corrupt. Number two, you started the nation building, and nation building by literally giving money. So there was no accountability. There was no M&E, monitoring evaluation. So the money was literally flowing on the street. There was more money in Afghanistan than people. So what it created a dependency on finance, on money, and a dependency by surging more troops. So the Afghan security forces said, well, there's a lot of Americans and international community forces here, so let's follow them. I think the money and the whole physical presence, it created an entire corruption in Afghanistan. Look, corruption fit into terrorism. There was people were making billions of dollars, millions of dollars. We see right now, Sagar is investigating their properties here in the United States, in Dubai, in Turkey, so many else in the world. So the Afghans lost. They were devastated. They were desperate. They were angry. They had grievance towards the former Afghan government. They did not believe in the leadership. In the last election, 900 or 750,000 people voted in a country of 38 million people. That explains a lot why Afghans were so desperate and sad. So the corruption and the leaders were feeding themselves. I think Afghanistan lost this sense of nationalism. So right now the Taliban are doing the same mistakes over and over. So by building a centralized government, there's no sense of nationalism, and the people are losing hope. So as long as there's no solid leadership, there's no inclusiveness, there's no way for them to compromise, the war will continue and the Afghans will continue to suffer more and more.
Benjamin, I want to ask you what your thoughts are looking at this anniversary that is now a public holiday in Afghanistan, when you see all the white Taliban flags waving in Massoud Circle, when you see the Taliban celebrating wearing largely U.S. uniforms, carrying M4s or M16s from the United States, also Humvees in the background, up-armored vehicles. What are your thoughts about this? When Joe Biden announced the strike on the al-Qaeda leader, Ayman Zawahiri, this past weekend, he said one reason, obviously did that, was the concern about al-Qaeda being back in Afghanistan. But when announcing the pullout a year ago, he said there's no more concern about having terrorist organizations in Afghanistan. Kind of make sense of all this for me.
Well, it's certainly a tragedy for the Afghan people who have been a victim for hundreds of years of foreign meddling. And I think the Taliban are a perfect example of the product of why this foreign meddling has been so destructive. I mean, of course, people should remember that in the 1980s, the CIA was supporting the predecessor to the Taliban, the Mujahideen. And the US, the Clinton administration welcomed the Taliban when they originally took power and brought some stability to the country. So like I said earlier, the real tragedy, in addition to all the people who lost their lives, is that after 20 years, all the US NATO occupation did was to further legitimize the Taliban and their extremist views. And I should point out the farce of all of this, which is that after 20 years, the US spent trillions of dollars, actually, if you look at the military spending overall, not just the spending on the Afghan government. And what happened? After just a few days after the US military withdrawal, the government collapsed. Clearly, the government that the US and NATO installed did not have much popular legitimacy. I'm not in any way trying to pardon the Taliban. I think they're an odious group, but we have to understand that the situation under the US NATO occupation was also still very bad for many Afghan people. Yes, women did have rights, which is something that's important, but there was widespread poverty. There was widespread food insecurity, even under the US NATO occupation. And I should point out that poverty did not get any better. In fact, in some areas of the country, it got worse. Access to electricity, access to water got worse. So this is supposed to be the golden era that we're supposed to, romanticize. But the reality is a lot of Afghans have been suffering for decades. And once again, this is a product of foreign meddling and not letting the Afghan people have their own self-determination.
So, Sanam, let's pick up on that. If the Afghan if Afghan government does have its way to govern its own people, where is this heading? One thing I will tell you, all the times I've been to Afghanistan, this was the first time I was able to drive anywhere in the country and feel safe. I drove to Paktika, up in the mountains near Host, crossed through Wardak, where much of that asphalt road would have large gravel areas. And I'd said, what is this from? And they said, that's where Taliban planted IEDs all this time. When we would get stopped by road checks, people would just let us keep going. But when you look at the children in that country, the faces, you mentioned that so many under the age of 25 in that country right now. The government says these people are, of course, going to have some kind of life. They're going to be able to have access to all the amenities of other nations. But do you think this could be a very narrow window that the Taliban is tolerant and allows people to come in and get a first-hand look?
So first of all, it's safe because the people who were attacking clinics and schools and so forth were the Taliban. So now they're in charge, right? So I assume that they're not going to be bombing maternity clinics with themselves in charge. I think that's one point we need to just be honest about. Secondly, here's the challenge for the Taliban. If they want to be running the country, now they've won, they beat NATO. That's basically what happened this time last year. They have responsibility. With power comes responsibility, and responsibility for their entire society, for the boys, for the girls, for the old, for the young, for the minority populations. If you want to run a country, you have to serve its population. You can't just say, I want power for myself, and I'm not going to be taking the responsibility to protect everybody. Mm-hmm. So it's up to them. It's up to them. They promised that girls could go to school during Nowruz, which was back in March. It didn't happen, right? So the minute they are willing to take on the responsibility to address the issues that their own population is raising, mm-hmm. I think the international community will also probably take steps and make amends. You can't have half the population leaving. Right now in Iran and Pakistan, there's a massive refugee crisis. Massive refugee crisis. So it's up to them to figure this out. And I think this is an opportunity, actually. It's an opportunity for them to show that they can be a member of the international community, they can uphold these rights. And again, as I said, the Quran explicitly states that every single Muslim has a duty to education, male or female.
That's one thing we heard a lot.
And
from women.
And just one last, if
Sure.
there's talking about culture, if they think that these issues are Western culture, well then so are the Humvees and the guns and the social media that they're using. So there's a level of hypocrisy which also needs to be called out. Thank you.
They are very good with social media. You're exactly right there. Ahmad, I want you to follow up to that, but beforehand, I spoke with a doctor about the growing hunger crisis within that country, and he basically agrees with Sanam. If changes would be made, perhaps this international aid would start coming in, and here's what it means to the people in Afghanistan.
Taliban government is working on security, and the security situation looks better than before. But when the other organization outside countries, they don't have their contribution with them, and maybe some of or most of the supports which were coming from the foreign countries or organization, that is stopped. It's a big challenge for Afghanistan.
Ahmad, we only have about a minute left in the program. I want to get your thoughts on that. What it would mean to free up all this money. And it's not like it would go to the Taliban leaders. This is money that would go to help Afghanistan move forward.
The 9 billion frozen assets is an Afghanistan money, Afghans money, and needs to go to the people. And the international community has an obligation to monitor that. And number two, to end poverty in Afghanistan and to bring some sort of peace in Afghanistan, you just literally start giving people jobs. And if you make them jobs, if you have them bring food to the table at the end of the day, I promise you that's how nation building starts. If people have food, they will not think about fighting. They didn't get angry. They didn't have this grievance of why I'm not having food. That's what Afghanistan is. By starting these initiatives, starting in small businesses, Afghans are really good with handcraft, and there used to be a lot of businesses. That's how you could start. I mean, a lot of humanitarian and global or nonprofit or development, they should start developing projects that could be implemented in Afghanistan while the politics is doing its own thing. So by empowering Afghans to look for jobs, to create jobs, you could see progress in the long run. Other than that, by isolating, just waiting for the politics or something to happen, more people will die.
Benjamin, I want to thank you and the rest of our panel. It's been a very lively discussion. There's a lot more that needs to be said. Thank heavens there's very strong voices like you four out there talking about Afghanistan. I appreciate it. And that does it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Sean Callebs in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us, everyone.